There are 7 simple statements that can make a narcissistic person suddenly step back, almost as if they have come face to face with something they cannot control. Their power does not come from being cruel, insulting, or aggressive. Their strength comes from being grounded in reality, and that is exactly what someone who relies on manipulation often struggles with the most. Let's be honest from the very beginning. Many people try to confront a narcissistic person, and the outcome usually leaves them feeling even more exhausted, confused, and defeated than before. Why does that happen? Because they unknowingly walk into a conflict designed by the other person. They bring honesty, empathy, fairness, and the hope that a calm conversation will solve everything. Those qualities are valuable in healthy relationships, but in a manipulative dynamic, they can become openings that are easily exploited. Instead of creating understanding, they are often used against you. It's like trying to negotiate with a powerful storm and expecting it to suddenly become peaceful because you asked politely. The real mistake is believing you're having a normal disagreement when you're actually caught inside a carefully controlled psychological game. A manipulative person often creates a version of reality where they are always the misunderstood victim, the innocent hero, or the person who deserves endless sympathy. Within that story, everyone else becomes the problem. Every emotional reaction you give, whether it's anger, sadness, frustration, or endless attempts to explain yourself, keeps you playing inside the version of reality they've created. And as long as you stay there, they control the direction of the conversation. Stay with me, because the next part changes everything. The balance of power shifts the moment you stop reacting automatically and begin responding with calm intention. That single change quietly removes you from the game they expected you to keep playing. An emotional reaction happens in an instant. It appears before you've had time to think. It may look like shouting, defending yourself, explaining every detail, or desperately trying to prove you're right. A thoughtful response is completely different. It comes from self-control rather than impulse. Instead of trying to defeat another person, it quietly refuses to participate in a conversation built on distortion. Your words stop becoming weapons and instead become clear boundaries rooted in reality. That's where language becomes incredibly powerful, not because it wounds someone, but because it refuses to support an unhealthy version of events. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand what often drives manipulative behavior beneath the surface. Despite appearances, many people who constantly seek control are deeply uncomfortable with being exposed. Behind confidence, grand promises, or constant self-praise may exist powerful feelings of insecurity, fear, and shame that they work very hard to hide. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It simply explains why certain calm, truthful statements can have such a strong effect. Their greatest fear isn't always losing an argument. It's losing control over the image they've carefully built. They work hard to maintain a version of themselves that feels untouchable, admired, or unquestioned. Anything that quietly shines light on the difference between appearance and reality can feel deeply uncomfortable. Don't miss what comes next, because this is where many people misunderstand the situation. The goal is never to expose someone for revenge or humiliation. The real goal is to stop participating in a pattern that keeps you emotionally trapped. Calm truth often accomplishes what endless arguments never will. Think back to a difficult conversation you've had in your own life. Have you ever reached a point where you were simply tired of defending yourself? Instead of arguing, you spoke calmly, honestly, and with very few words. And almost immediately, the entire atmosphere changed. Maybe the other person became quiet. Maybe they suddenly ended the conversation. Maybe they realized they could no longer pull you into the same cycle. If you've experienced something like that, it probably wasn't an accident. There is a powerful psychological reason behind it. Manipulative behavior often depends on emotional reactions because strong emotions are easier to redirect, confuse, or control. But calm certainty is much harder to manipulate. Someone who refuses to argue endlessly, refuses to defend obvious truths, and refuses to abandon their own reality becomes much more difficult to influence. That's why the 7 statements you're about to discover matter so much. They aren't designed to hurt anyone. They aren't meant to provoke fear or create conflict. Their purpose is much simpler. They help you stay connected to your own reality instead of becoming trapped inside someone else's version of it. And once you truly understand that difference, every future interaction begins to change. The next statement may completely reshape how you handle difficult people, so make sure you stay until the end. You may recognize a pattern you've been living through for years without realizing it. Take a moment to think back to a time when something like this happened in your own life. As you continue listening, ask yourself a few simple questions. What exactly did you say? What was your tone? How did the other person respond? You may discover that you've already experienced this principle without fully recognizing it. This brings us to something incredibly important: verbal boundaries. Let's make one thing absolutely clear. Setting a boundary through your words is not an act of aggression. Aggression tries to control, punish, or hurt another person. A healthy boundary is completely different. It is an act of self-respect. It is the quiet decision that no one else gets to define your reality or decide what is acceptable in your life. Picture a property line between two pieces of land. Aggression means crossing into someone else's space. A boundary simply means standing firmly on your own side and calmly saying, "This is where my limit is." The words themselves matter, but they are only part of the equation. Stay with me because this changes everything. Your tone is what gives those words their real strength. A boundary shouted in anger often becomes an invitation to another argument. It tells the other person that they have successfully pulled you into an emotional battle. But a boundary spoken with calm certainty carries a completely different kind of power. It doesn't beg. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't try to win. It simply states what is true and refuses to move. That kind of confidence quietly changes the entire conversation because it refuses to play by the rules of manipulation. What happens when you begin communicating this way consistently? The transformation reaches far beyond one difficult relationship. Something changes inside you. The respect you begin receiving from others doesn't appear because they suddenly become kinder. It grows naturally because your own self-respect becomes visible. People notice when someone no longer accepts unhealthy behavior. They notice when someone stops explaining themselves over and over or chasing approval that never comes. Most importantly, you stop becoming a character inside someone else's story and begin writing your own. That is where genuine personal strength begins. Here's an idea that may feel uncomfortable at first. Manipulative people don't always disrespect others because those people are weak. Often they're drawn toward qualities they secretly admire but struggle to develop within themselves. Confidence without arrogance. Genuine kindness without hidden motives. Inner peace that doesn't depend on constant attention. Those qualities can feel threatening to someone who has built their identity around control rather than authenticity. Think of it this way. A manipulative person rarely chooses people at random. They observe carefully. They notice emotional patterns. They test boundaries. They're often attracted to individuals who possess qualities that are valuable because those qualities offer opportunities for influence if left unprotected. The next part might surprise you because the traits that make you an appealing target are often the very same traits that make you a remarkable person. The problem isn't your kindness. The problem is when kindness exists without healthy boundaries to protect it. One of the biggest qualities that often attracts manipulative behavior is empathy. Your ability to understand people, forgive mistakes, and believe the best about others is a beautiful strength. But without clear boundaries, that same empathy can become an open door for someone who wants to take advantage of it. Another quality is competence. You work hard, you solve problems, you achieve meaningful results. People naturally recognize your abilities, and someone who constantly seeks attention or validation may try to attach themselves to those accomplishments or benefit from your efforts. Then there is integrity. You value honesty. You try to keep your word. You assume most people also care about fairness because that's how you choose to live. That assumption makes it difficult to imagine someone who deliberately twists facts, ignores responsibility, or manipulates situations for personal gain. That's why recognizing unhealthy patterns can take longer than expected. You keep searching for the honesty you would naturally offer yourself. But once you understand this dynamic, everything begins to shift. You stop believing that every misunderstanding can be solved through endless explanations. You stop carrying responsibility for another person's choices. Instead, you protect your peace, trust your instincts, and allow your actions to reflect your values rather than someone else's behavior. Real confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need to prove anything. It quietly stands on solid ground and refuses to abandon reality, no matter how much pressure is applied. So let me ask you something. Which of these qualities describes you the most? Your empathy, your integrity, or your determination to always do the right thing? Let me know in the comments. And if this message helped you understand these patterns in a new way, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need to hear it today. One of the most difficult truths to understand is that the qualities that make you a good person can sometimes leave you more vulnerable in unhealthy relationships. Your kindness, your compassion, your honesty, and your willingness to see the best in people can become the very traits someone manipulative tries to take advantage of. This is one of the painful twists of these dynamics. The warmth you naturally bring into the world can attract people who are looking for something they cannot create within themselves. Instead of appreciating your confidence, your achievements, or your genuine care for others, they may feel threatened by them. In some cases, they may even try to diminish those qualities because being around someone secure reminds them of what they struggle to feel inside. Stay with me, because this next part explains why these situations often become so confusing. Rarely does manipulation begin with obvious attacks. It usually starts with small tests that seem harmless on the surface. Maybe it's a compliment mixed with an insult. Maybe it's a promise that quietly disappears without explanation. Maybe it's a joke at your expense that feels just uncomfortable enough to sting, yet casual enough that if you object, you're told you're too sensitive or unable to take a joke. These moments aren't always random. They often serve as quiet experiments to discover where your boundaries are and whether you'll protect them. Every reaction teaches the other person something. If you repeatedly excuse the behavior, laugh it off, or ignore your own discomfort to avoid conflict, they may begin believing those boundaries can be pushed even further. That's how unhealthy patterns often begin. Not through one dramatic moment, but through many small moments that slowly change what starts to feel acceptable. This is one of the biggest differences between ordinary disagreements and ongoing manipulation. Healthy relationships naturally include misunderstandings, but both people eventually listen, reflect, apologize when necessary, and work together toward a solution. Respect remains even during conflict. Manipulation follows a completely different path. Instead of solving problems, it slowly changes the rules of the relationship. Small acts of disrespect become slightly larger ones. A forgotten promise becomes repeated disappointment. A sarcastic remark turns into open humiliation. One crossed boundary quietly becomes permission to cross another. This gradual pattern is what makes manipulation so difficult to recognize while you're living through it. Every step feels only slightly worse than the one before, making it easy to believe you're simply overreacting. Don't miss what comes next, because understanding this process can completely change how you protect yourself. Each time a healthy boundary is ignored without being addressed, the relationship quietly resets around that new standard. The behavior that once shocked you begins to feel ordinary simply because you've experienced it so many times. That doesn't mean it has become acceptable. It only means you've slowly adapted to something that never should have become normal in the first place. The human mind is remarkably good at adapting. That ability helps us survive difficult situations, but it can also work against us when we're exposed to unhealthy treatment over long periods of time. Little by little, constant criticism begins feeling ordinary. Walking on eggshells becomes part of your daily routine. You start carefully choosing every word, trying to avoid another argument or another emotional outburst. Eventually, you may forget what simple respect, emotional safety, and genuine kindness are supposed to feel like. That's why many thoughtful, caring people don't immediately recognize these patterns. Their own strengths often make them more likely to search for explanations instead of seeing warning signs. Empathy encourages them to give another chance. Integrity encourages them to keep their promises even when the other person doesn't. Optimism encourages them to believe tomorrow will finally be different. None of those qualities are weaknesses by themselves. They're valuable parts of a healthy personality. The problem appears only when those strengths exist without clear boundaries to protect them. The moment you begin trusting your own instincts, listening to your discomfort instead of dismissing it, and treating your boundaries as something worth defending, everything starts to change. You stop measuring yourself by someone else's approval. You stop accepting behavior that slowly chips away at your confidence. And you begin remembering something incredibly important. Respect isn't something you have to earn by tolerating mistreatment. It's the minimum standard every healthy relationship should already provide. So let me ask you this. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the warning signs were there from the very beginning, but they were so small that you overlooked them? Share your experience in the comments. And if this message helped you recognize a pattern you hadn't noticed before, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. Your natural desire to keep the peace, your habit of calming difficult situations, and your willingness to believe the best about people can sometimes become disadvantages in an unhealthy relationship. Instead of recognizing repeated disrespect for what it is, you may begin searching for innocent explanations. You tell yourself they probably didn't mean it that way. Maybe they're just under stress. Maybe they're having a difficult week. Maybe tomorrow they'll be different. Little by little, you begin protecting their behavior while questioning your own instincts. The painful alternative that someone is repeatedly choosing to treat you with disrespect is so difficult to accept that your mind looks for easier explanations instead. This is where self-doubt quietly takes hold. You begin wondering if you're too sensitive, too emotional, or simply imagining problems that aren't really there. That uncertainty becomes one of the strongest tools a manipulative person can rely on. Instead of questioning their actions, you begin questioning your own reality. Before long, you stop trusting your judgment altogether, but eventually, there comes a moment when everything changes. Sometimes it's one unmistakable act that suddenly connects every confusing experience you've been trying to explain away. In that instant, the entire pattern becomes visible. All the small moments you've ignored finally fit together, and you realize something important has to change. Not because you can control another person's behavior, but because you finally recognize that protecting your own peace has to become your responsibility. Stay with me, because the next part may completely change the way you respond in these situations. The statements you're about to learn aren't designed to insult, embarrass, or defeat anyone. They are simple expressions of reality. Their purpose isn't to create conflict. Their purpose is to keep you connected to the truth instead of becoming trapped inside someone else's version of events. The first statement is incredibly simple. I see what's happening. Few responses are more unsettling to someone who depends on manipulation because their influence often relies on confusion, uncertainty, and plausible denial. Manipulation usually hides inside small comments, subtle criticism, mixed messages, or harmless-looking jokes that can later be dismissed as misunderstandings. If you react emotionally, you're often told you misunderstood, you're imagining things, or you're being too sensitive. But calmly saying, I see what's happening, quietly changes everything. It doesn't invite an argument. It doesn't demand an explanation. It simply communicates that you recognize the pattern and refuse to ignore it anymore. That's what gives the statement its strength. You don't have to list every example or prove every detail. Your calm awareness speaks louder than endless explanations. Don't miss what comes next, because awareness alone often changes the entire interaction. When someone realizes their usual tactics are no longer invisible, they lose one of their strongest sources of influence. The conversation immediately begins operating on a different foundation, one based on clarity instead of confusion. The second statement is just as important. That isn't my responsibility. People who avoid accountability often try to place the weight of their choices onto someone else. Their frustration becomes your fault. Their poor decisions become your responsibility to fix. Their emotional reactions become something you're expected to manage. Without realizing it, you begin carrying burdens that were never yours to carry. This simple statement gently places those responsibilities back where they belong. It doesn't reject compassion. It doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It simply recognizes the difference between offering support and accepting responsibility for another adult's choices. Healthy relationships allow each person to own their actions, emotions, and decisions. Unhealthy relationships blur those boundaries until one person is constantly sacrificing their own peace to protect someone else from the consequences of their behavior. Learning to say, "That isn't my responsibility," may feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're naturally generous and helpful. But protecting your own emotional well-being isn't selfish, it's necessary. In fact, healthy boundaries benefit everyone involved because they encourage personal responsibility instead of dependence. The more consistently you practice this mindset, the more confident you become in your own judgment. You stop apologizing for things you didn't cause. You stop trying to solve problems that don't belong to you. Most importantly, you stop believing that your value depends on how much emotional weight you're willing to carry for someone else. So let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself taking responsibility for another person's choices simply because you wanted to keep the peace? Share your experience in the comments. And if this message helped you recognize something important, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who could benefit from hearing it today.